Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Forest Stewardship webinar on white and black oak management. We have several guest speakers here tonight, and I appreciate all of you for joining. I will ask the speakers as they start their section to introduce themselves, and I've already given you co-host status, so you should be good to go. Yana, we'll go ahead and start with you tonight.
Well, good evening, everyone. I recognize some names out there in the little boxes here. I'm Yana Valachovic, along with Kim Ingram, Susie Coker, Jeff Stackhouse. I see Ricky Satomi, Katie, Sophia. We're all with the University of California in the extension program. And so I'm going to get us started with a introduction to this oak woodland ecology issue. And so give me a moment as I work through this whole awkward process of going from start to finish. So I'm going to talk about in two parts this issue of restoration around white oak and black oak in respect to this conifer encroachment issue. And I'm going to tap into your science brain and your nerd style. So bear with me as I work through this, but I think the science is kind of fun and I'll try and make it accessible. So the first part is really setting the stage around the ecology of these species. And then there'll be a couple of great talks in between from Jeff and Pascal, and then I'll wrap it up with some of the management work. A portion of this is published, and so there's the hot link there to a paper if you'd like to get in deeper. But what we're really talking about is this issue that I think many of us have probably seen for decades, which is this issue of we have these majestic deciduous oak stands, and they often get filled in by a carpet of young seedlings that aren't matching what's on the overstory. So they're a carpet of seedlings of something else. And in most cases, it's Douglas fir. In some cases, it can be something different. And so we set out as a group really to try and understand this issue. And so what I'm going to highlight are a series of projects that we've been involved with since 2015, and it involves a whole lot of colleagues from the University of California, UC Berkeley, Humboldt State, now Cal Poly Humboldt, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, CAL FIRE, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, landowners, a bunch of people on the policy front, and we've got funding that came from the University of California and the Natural Resources Conservation Service. So today I'm going to talk about the ones that are in orange, but this has been a fun, almost decade now of trying to understand this oak issue. So we started with a project looking at characterizing conifer encroachment from the perspective around the age, structure, and biodiversity of these stands. And then we moved on to a second project that evaluated some of the cost share and assistance programs that, for those of you who've been taking our classes, are available to landowners. And some of those programs specifically target oak woodlands from a restoration perspective. And so we were curious about tree response, oak health, forage, wildlife considerations, and whether that restoration was effective. So I'm going to give you a little snippet of that. Jeff is going to talk about oak regeneration and the effect of cattle and deer on oak seedling success. And we have a new project that's looking at water demands of conifer encroachment. So what's the ecosystem consequence of having all this densification? What happens when you make these sites more moist because there's so much more overstory, which we won't talk about tonight, but I just want to give you a teaser that that's out there. And then we were fortunate to have an opportunity in kind of tragedy. Wildfire burned through a number of our stands. And so I'll end tonight's talk later in the evening around what the impact of wildfire is on stands that have had conifer removal. And we've got a final project in our suite that's looking at the economic analysis of managing for oaks and conifers in kind of transitioning sites. So there's an arc to our work. I'm going to highlight just a couple of those and just really want to acknowledge and appreciate all the folks that have been working with us along the way. And So I'm talking specifically about California black oak, Quercus callagii, and Oregon white oak or Gary oak, known as Quercus garryana. This is an image of Quercus callagii or black oak. It's from where I grew up in the county of Humboldt, and it's an old big tree. And you can see that it's under pressure from both some shrubs, some manzanita in this case, as well as this fir, both of which we've been able to take care of on my property. But it's this interesting challenge of how do we view these trees? And I would say, while I've not cored this tree, that I would estimate this one to be somewhere in the 350 to 400-year-old range. And I think we often think of these as not that old, but in reality, they can be a lot older than you think. And so as I paint the stage of this challenge around oaks and conifers, I want to really identify that California has kind of dueling identities. Are we an oak state? Are we a conifer state? And how do we think about that when you've got a certain species group that's in the wrong place? And so it becomes this interesting challenge and battle in our policies and our regulations around what we're supposed to be managing for. So today, I'm really going to be trying to look at these broad issues that ultimately lead to tools for landowners and how we've been able to, with a bunch of partners, rewrite California's regulatory framework to help private landowners in battling this kind of dueling identity that California is stuck with. So hope that you'll find that entertaining. I think it's been a great and fun journey with a lot of fun people to work on this. So Rosemary Sheriff on the left from Cal Poly Humboldt, Lena Quinn Davidson on the right, good colleague. And one of the things that you realize in these oak stands is that the floristic diversity is amazing. And so this stand would be something that we would call in the very early stages of encroachment, where you have mostly an intact grass understory with a bunch of other herbaceous plants. And you can see the conifers are starting to come in a little bit in the edges here. And I just want to really acknowledge, and we're not going to go into great detail, but there is tremendous flora and fauna, and the biodiversity of these sites is staggering. And so they really become great places for ecosystem services. And I think we have a very much a human cultural identity with these stands and these locations. So I hope to kind of tap into some of what we all love about forests and woodlands of California, and then all the other associates that come with that. They're often difficult to tell apart. So here's an image of a variety of oak species. You can see the encroachment. I don't know if my cursor will show up here in the understory, where here the Douglas fir is just getting started in the shadow lines of what I think is the white oak and then the black oak. They are possible to tell apart. It's not that hard, but the white oak will start a little greener in the beginning season as it starts to leaf out. The black oak will be a little redder, a little pinker, and so the springtime is a great time to be able to look at the diversity, because you can look at a landscape and go, oh, that's a little greener and that's a little pinker. Oh, wow, look how these species are co-occupying the same space. But these open woodlands to savannas, I think, are places that we all really enjoy for many reasons. And so that oak identity, that golden hills of California, that rolling hills of California, is paired with this kind of deep, dense conifer landscape that can be expressed as shown here in redwood, but it can also be in the mixed conifer forests of much of California. And so there's this kind of, I just want to say, this dichotomy between, are we an oak state, or are we a conifer state, or are we both, and how do we frame these issues? And so what happens when you end up with both species in the same site? So here's an example where the Douglas fir is about to pierce the canopy of the oak woodlands. And so the photosynthetic capacity, the ability for those oak trees to get energy through photosynthesis, is about to be eclipsed by that vigorous, fast-growing conifer understory, which is, as I said, about to occupy and dominate and take over that stand. So what do you manage for in a condition like this? Should you choose the conifers, which often have higher commercial value, or should you choose the oak woodlands, which maybe have less value but have more cultural value, maybe provide some hunting potential from an economic return perspective, or a bunch of other ecosystem services? These are tough questions for landowners, and what we've been after is trying to figure out, what's the sweet spot? What do you do in a situation like this? Who do you choose? And can the regulatory framework support the work that you might choose? There are no right or wrong answers in this. I just want to say, like, it's really up to the landowner to make that decision, but we want to make sure you have the full complement of tools and resources to be able to make that choice and follow through on your goals. As you move more to the interior from the Coast Range heading to the east, you can see this process where it's often on the north slopes or the east slopes, which tend to be a little wetter, where the conifers get a stronghold, and they really start to change this landscape to one where it's dominated by these evergreen trees from what was a deciduous landscape. Moving a little more to the west, it's often easiest to see this in the winter when the oaks are deciduous and their shape and their color will stand out and be more prominent. You can see here in the lower left where the canopies are sticking out amongst these darker green Douglas fir trees. So how long does this process take? And what does it really mean? That was some of the question that we were after. So moving to the second part of the talk, I want to talk about this, this challenge to these oak species. So let's figure out first where they are. So on the left is a map of the rough distribution of white oak, which is shown in green. White oak has a huge range, comes all the way from Canada into the Puget Sound, working its way through Washington, through the Willamette Valley, and is mostly through the Klamath Range and into the Coast Range here of California. But there's a couple of disjunct populations and some of it down near Santa Cruz and San Mateo counties. And underneath that is this footprint of California black oak, which has a much broader distribution throughout California, shown in the hatched green. My team and I work primarily in the northern part and the western part of California. And so our research sites were in Humboldt, Trinity, and Mendocino. And so you can see where that overlap is from those counties and that map, just to illustrate where the oakier stands are. So we've got more conifers to the coast, more oaks to the interior. And so the framework of the work we did was a study that involved 10 replicated research sites across portions of 3 counties, and they ranged across both Zurich in the drier sites to more Music in the cool wet sites. You can see precipitation mapped against or charted against July or summer temperatures. And so we were curious about whether there are unique effects based on where these plots were located. And what we strived to do was basically find a complement of 3 stages of encroachment, from this early process where they're just getting started in the understory to this midway process where they haven't quite overtopped the conifers, and to what we call this later stage, where here you can see that we have almost sawlog sized trees here, and they're well overtopped the oaks themselves, and it doesn't take long for the oaks to start to fall out of the system. So in each of those 10 sites, we looked for locations that had these 3 conditions. And here's some graphs and charts. So the early stage, we tend to be largely dominated by white oak stands. And in the later stage, Douglas fir dominated those same equivalent counterparts. So the process was, we were able to document kind of as we expected. And I just want to bring forward the white oak issue is quite interesting to me, because white oak tends to occur in a little clayier soils, a little less hospitable to Douglas fir. So it makes sense that we had sites that were more dominated by white oak than black oak. Black oak tends to grow in a more well-drained site with a little sandier soils. And so that's a perfect place for Douglas fir. So the encroachment process, I think, happens faster in the black oak than the white oak. But here we are 100 and something years into the encroachment process. And so it makes sense what's in better condition is really these sites that are poorer supporting to the Douglas fir. You can follow up with me if that doesn't make sense. So there are lots of examples of this, hard to photograph, and to many eyes, especially if you're coming from the Sierras, you might look at this and go, well, this is looks like a typical mixed conifer site where you've got some component of oaks. And in reality, it's not. This is an oak woodland that has had, in this case, Douglas fir, move in and become dominant. And it's taken, I think, a lot of work for us to kind of recalibrate our eyes and realize what has been occurring in this process. So one of the questions we had was, what is the regeneration success that's happening? What seedlings are we seeing over time in these sites? And what's happening to their success? And within that, are we seeing these trees, these oak trees, be able to reproduce? And so, sure enough, what we've seen is that the seedlings, so that's an individual that's at diameter breast height less than 1 inch around in diameter. So it's, what you typically think of a seedling, but not quite up to the sapling size where it's greater than 1 inch at 4.5 feet. So we have lots of seedlings that are being established in these sites in the early stage. And that process begins to decline over time as you move through these stages of encroachment. So that's an important variable to understand. The good news is that the trees are still capable of producing viable acorns, and those acorns are capable of regenerating. Like, we haven't shut the regeneration process off, but their seedling survival success has not been good. One of the other key questions we have in this is to understand whether we're looking at single-stemmed or multi-stemmed individuals. So take a moment and think about what creates a multi-stemmed individual. So that is where the base has multiple trees coming out of it. And from our interpretation, that's a product of some kind of disturbance. So the tree that was maybe originally there has been damaged in some way, so that the tree that sprouts back there's a lot of sprouting potential. And so you end up with a multi-stemmed individual. And so across our sites, and so here I'm showing proportion of tree establishment against time period for white oak, black oak, and Douglas fir, which doesn't sprout. And what you can see is there's a high proportion of trees that are multi-stemmed. Why would that be important? Well, it's important because it helps us understand that these trees are a product of a long history, and that these oaks have been on the stand in that location for a long time period. So it's not like these are initial trees that have been established for the first time. There was a mama tree before that, and maybe a mama tree or a mama tree before that. That makes sense for you. So as I wrap up this opening frame, I want to end with a graphic that I'm going to take a moment to explain, which has been some of the most profound element of our work. And so what you'll see is proportion of tree establishment on the y-axis against time. And while we didn't do a full census of all the trees that are out there, we've got a good sense that there's a bunch of older trees, a bunch of trees dating back to 1650 and such. But as you zoom across time, what happens? All of a sudden in 1850, there's this pulse of young trees that are established. And so the Oregon white oak, or the Gary oak, is in this gray. This is the smoothing line for the Oregon white oak. The black oak is this black line here. It also pulses. And then you can see that Douglas fir works its way around, and then Douglas fir is the dominant tree that became established, especially after 1950 going forward. So, wow, to see a graph where everything has this age relationship and it's tied really specifically to this 1850 period. We sat around and scratched our head, and we still kind of do. I mean, none of us were alive in 1850. It's hard to know exactly what happened, but it shows there was some strong relationship. And so what happened in 1850? 1849 is gold rush. We have a whole lot of Euro-Americans basically moving into California. That's obvious. And so there's something that has coincided with the gold rush. that is prominent in California. And what's interesting is across all 10 sites, they have the exact same signature. There is a sequencing that occurs across these sites. So it's not unique to one location. This is not an average of just one location. It really is reflective of what's been happening across these sites. So there's a synchrony across there. So Jeff's going to lead it from here in a minute, but what we've concluded, and this is our working hypothesis, it's going to be difficult for us to be able to answer that question, is that you can see that the oaks were around before then, but something changed and allowed this massive, and we're going to interpret it as release of these oaks, both black oak and white oak. And what we interpreted it as to be is a release from browse pressure. And, because there are browsing species that will eat these young seedlings. And how we interpret it is you move a whole lot of people to California. It takes a while to get agriculture to come together. It takes a while to be able to have domesticated animals available for protein sources. And we look at this as basically a removal of game across California that basically reduced the browsing potential basically on these young trees. And all of a sudden you take the browsers off and the trees are able to move into true tree size. Now, what's fascinating about it is that it really starts to decline in 1920. And that is by policy when we change what's allowable from a market perspective. So you could sell deer meat commercially until 1920. And then we prohibited that moving forward. And so this pulse of regeneration basically doesn't occur afterwards because we think the deer populations begin to return. So that's our working hypothesis. We don't know the answer, but we've been after trying to understand what browse pressure has to do on these stands. So I don't know, Jeff, if you want to say anything more before I shut down, and if I've got that right from your perspective, but I will close my share here and turn it over to Kim and then maybe Jeff.
Thanks, Yana. So we do have quite a few questions. Maybe we'll just do one for now, and then we'll save the rest till the end. So the question I had queued up went away. It looks like black oak seedlings go up with establishment duration. Why might that be?
I'm gonna have to look at the graphic for a minute. Jeff, do you have any thoughts?
Sorry, I was reading the next question that just.
Let me ponder that while Jeff speaks here. I mean, there's some good questions. The basic line is we don't have all the answers. I think the key question is that we're capable of making more trees because we know that these trees are reproducing through acorns, but we have a hard time getting them to the sapling size class. So we've got seedlings, but we don't have saplings. And so holding on to what we have has become more and more important because we're really not making new stands of these trees. So what you'll see as I pick up is sort of how do we bring that management toolbox to you as a landowner or as a land manager to be able to incorporate that while we can kind of catch up in this regeneration issue.
Thanks, Yana. All right, Jeff, we'll turn it over to you, and why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself as well.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jeff Stackhouse. I'm the Livestock and Natural Resources Advisor for the North Coast here. I live in Fortuna and work in Eureka, California. And I'm fortunate to be part of kind of this bigger team of folks. We have some fire experts and some tree experts, and then there's just kind of one loathly cow person that gets drug along with the rest of them. But that's me, and it's the role I'm lucky enough to play. So, so Yana just got done showing, this graph and kind of talked briefly about some of the ideas and that we've kicked around over the years, and kind of one of my hypotheses is the commercial hunting piece, but I'm not sure that's true. Maybe it's maybe that 1850 time period is I don't know, maybe it's release of trees because they were being cut down and they were resprouting because they were used for firewood or for steam powered engines, or I don't know what's going on. But I love this graph, and it's kind of the basis for the project I'm going to talk about here, which is trying to figure out why we're not seeing any babies. And one of the reasons that is often pointed to, which I think is quite valid, is that, that livestock were introduced during this time period. So that's definitely in the suite of hypotheses. What else changed during that time period? A whole bunch of stuff, right? We had a change in fire regimes. Maybe there was new diseases or insects. I don't know. We definitely see losses to trees, which I'll talk about more later in terms of sapling sized trees. To insects, particularly grasshoppers in the rangeland settings. Is it because of climate change? Whether natural or anthropogenic or otherwise, who cares? But is it a new frequency of droughts? And it's pretty well documented that droughts kill baby trees. Anybody that has a garden knows that if they forget to water the garden, that there's drought issues, right? So at any rate, there's all sorts of ideas as to what could or could not be causing it. But it's definitely a problem, and I don't really care so much about what the cause of the problem is if there's a way that I can get around it. So when you step back and you think about, and this is one of Yana's slides, but when you think about like where do we see the oak saplings? So where are the trees existing that are making it from the seedling stage and making it to this sapling stage? And Jan's talking about tree terms and diameter of breast height. I don't know what that all means, but when I think of a seedling, it's like in Jeff's world, it's shorter than my kneecap. And when I think of a sapling, it's somewhere between my kneecap and and my head. Um, so that's kind of my terminology. But what you'll see really commonly is these trees growing up in like anthropogenic structures, like maybe an H brace along a fence, or an old brush pile that was built that never got burned because it was built not very well, or or like in these more natural examples that Yana has, we have oaks coming up in tall fescue, which those of you that don't have it, it's a very beautiful grass. It burns very well in the winter months. It has nearly little to no livestock value, but it's excellent for passerine nesting species. And, it's just an awesome, robust grass. And then one of the other places we'll see it come out a lot is through Himalaya blackberry bushes or in poison oak patches. And kind of one of the things that I'll point out here is like, I call it kind of the pumpkin look. Is if you look at this image on the left, there's a seed, like there's a bush of oak seedlings that are continuously being browsed by deer or livestock, and then eventually one gets to stick its arm out and reach for the sun, and become the green growing part of the pumpkin, if you will. And I don't know how else to describe it other than the pumpkin look to me. Where these things eventually get tall enough to where a deer can't reach them or a cow can't reach them, and then they're off to the races and they turn into a tree. And I'm looking forward to Pascal's talk from a wildfires perspective, where there's so much of this pumpkin look on the landscape that they get released, I think, sooner, and then it becomes a problem where maybe you have to come in and do some pruning. But without mass release at a landscape scale, there's enough browsers on the landscape naturally to kind of keep it in this pumpkin look in most cases. So I wonder a lot about, the 1850 era and whether there was a whole lot of these pumpkins that didn't have stems at the time because the deer populations were so high, and then you had commercial hunting come in and reduce the deer population enough to where you could get this initial stem release, and then that's why we saw a big peak of establishment at that time. But like I said, I'm certainly not the most knowledgeable person on this call for that. So the other place that I think is notable of where we see good transition from seedling to sapling and sapling to then mature trees is in our vineyards and our cannabis farms on the North Coast. And what are some of the attributes that those two, landscape features have? One of which is a large deer fence that's typically very well maintained. There's some sense of herbaceous vegetation management, whether it's weed whacking or herbicide or other. There's a frequent human presence, which to me, I think really the main point of that is, a wildlife deterrent. It's typically an open canopy where there's lots of sunlight, and generally speaking, there's no livestock. So, so when we start talking about kind of the hypotheses and the things, it's like, oh yeah, no wonder why, oaks regenerate and marijuana grows. So, but I want to touch base a little bit on this livestock piece. And the world of livestock, for those of you that aren't familiar, kind of goes from browsers on one end, which eat primarily bushes, all the way down to grazers on the other end that eat primarily grasses. And you're wondering, well, why is this guy got pictures of a bunch of faces of livestock? And really, I'm just trying to point out that, like, if you look at the top two images here on the left, like a cow has a very wide mouth, and you can't see it in this picture, but a cow does not have teeth on the top of the roof of her mouth. So she's really not designed to pick leaves off of a tree and have like a minute grazing strategy. And a horse also has a wide mouth, but can expose her teeth to where she can graze shorter than a cow, but also has a very flat mouth that typically is not a great browser. Whereas sheep has a kind of an in-between, we'll call a sheep a tweener, so they can browse and graze, where a goat kind of has this little pointy V mouth, and a long tongue and these little nimble lips, and she can very carefully pick leaves off of prickly branches and things. So when you start thinking about livestock, if you're not a livestock person, you can really know a lot about what they want to eat just by glancing over the fence and seeing what kind of a mouth structure they have. So when we start talking about animals and their potential interest or attraction towards eating an oak tree, for example, we can look at a mouth and pretty quickly say, okay, these top two, might be eating it out of curiosity or on accident if it's a small one while they're taking a big mouthful of grass, but they're probably not going to really target a medium to a larger size oak tree as aggressively as these two on the bottom. So that was a very brief livestock behavior 101. The other threat that we have on the landscape that's a very real threat, is some of our worst players in terms of large mammals are pigs, deer, and elk. On the North Coast, we have Roosevelt elk, but all elk behave relatively similarly. And again, if you look at their mouth structures, you can get an idea of the pigs are going to be digging, the elk are going to be grazing, the deer are going to be doing some combination of browsing and selecting high quality forbs in a grassland setting. So the other piece that we have on the landscape that I think is often under discussed is that we have these little critters in the world of insects, and I'm not an entomologist, but I think a lot about how much biomass is produced on our landscape that gets consumed by these guys. And in this 8-year trial I'm about to get into, these pictures on the right are pictures of oak trees that I've been monitoring for over 8 years, that I'm not sure are going to be alive when I come back this next year. And it is 100% grasshopper damage, has nothing to do with livestock or deer. So it's a little interesting to think about, like, not only the episodic nature of drought and weather and fire, but then the episodic nature of insects is also interesting. And I think like another piece when we talk about oak trees, where we want oak trees, where we don't want oak trees, I really encourage people to own it as people of the landscape because it's been that way for for thousands of years where people are managing these oak stands where they want them and how they want them. And even if, even if you're like myself and your family has a piece of property like the one in this image, our family's property was burned in the fountain fire, and in the fire footprint on the edges where it burnt in high severity, the oak regeneration is more than you can handle. You can't hardly walk through it. And then where it burnt in low severity, we have these huge relic trees that we've tried coring, but they're hollow in the middle, so we have no idea. But they're well over 400 or 500 years old, and there's no regeneration under those trees. So, for example, my family fights oak regeneration as a weed on 99% of the property. And then under these relic trees, we struggle to try to get, any seedlings established. So I think that, um, where the seedlings want and are willing to establish naturally, it makes sense to save them if they're in the spots you want to, but it also, they can be a weed species too. So, but really concentrating on where we want them, how can you protect them? And some of the things that I guess I want to point out just briefly is like, some of the things that we use to protect oaks, like this, tree sleeve or tree cover on the right can attract cows, which then cause damage. Other things like, this bigger exclosure, you can see the pickup on the lower left. Cows are attracted to it, they're curious about it, but they can't get in it. But a deer can still very easily jump in that and cause damage if you're protecting oaks. And then you can have something smaller like this on the right, which takes way more manpower in terms of time and effort and labor, and also just tons more material to do it at such a small stand, but it's small enough to where a deer won't jump into it because they'll get tangled up. So there's a lot of pros and cons of each, and there's a ton of work that's been done in the state of California and in other states. And this is honestly an embarrassing list because I didn't get through enough of it. But I think some of the highlights are essentially like once oaks are 6 feet tall, they're pretty tough. Even if you exclude livestock, ungulates can still be a problem. If you completely get rid of livestock, sometimes you have other issues with, habitat for other species like grasshoppers and voles. Plant competition, can reduce soil moisture for young trees. And then, like I already talked about, you can add these tree tubes, which increases survivorship and vigor. But then maybe you're attracting cows, which are gonna destroy the trees and step on them. So there's a lot of things, but I think one of the things I want to point out on this list that resonates with me is that without protection, white 1966, like without protection, these seedlings can sit there stunted in a browse state for decades. And I think decades may even be an under exaggeration. And then you continue over into the, McCreary et al. Stuff that was kind of a lit review. They talk about hog rooting and drought and trees under canopies, and the take home on, I think, on this publication was that seedling size, if you're going to use seedlings that are already established, and you're going to try to protect those to get them to turn into trees, that seedling size and vigor at the beginning of that effort is strongly correlated to survival and growth. So if you are going to take the time and effort to go protect some of these things, protect the ones that have been there the longest, because they probably have, the best root base and the best ability to respond to your, quote unquote release. So I'm going to go through this study pretty quickly, but Langaquin Davidson and I started basically caging trees 8 years ago. We did it on 3 ranches where we had 3 treatments, like a no fenced control area where there was nothing. We just put down some short metal stakes and and quantified what was there. And then we did kind of larger, strategically placed 2-strand barbed wire fencing where it was on an area that was on a game trail that the deer couldn't easily get out of. So basically put this 2-strand barbed wire in a spot where we thought the deer would be kind of funneled or forced to go under the 2-strand fence and inhabit the area. And then we did what we called, deer. So we called that the 2-strand barbed wire was a cow exclosure. And then we did a deer and cow exclosure for our hog wire fence, which you can see there in the foreground that had been beat up by either elk or beef cows over the years, but still kind of looks like a plot. And I think it's important to note that one of the 3 ranches sold. So the statistical relevance of this data is pretty weak. Actually, it's incredibly weak. But I think there's still some important things that we attempted to qualify or quantify, and that was kind of the tree density in these plots, tree height, number of leaves, and proportion of leaf remaining after browse from insects or otherwise, and then like an establishment rating of 1 to 5, where 1 was it was a newly hatched, if you will, acorn, where the acorn was still attached and usually had 1 or 2 leaflets. That'd be a 1. And then a 5 is a plant that if you grabbed a hold of it with your bare hand and tried to pull it out of the ground, you would have a tough time. So I'll go through the 2 properties that remained, and you'll see the data in a couple different formats. So this plot here is on a ranch called the Cottrell Ranch, which has really great deep soils, grows conifer trees very well. And the top line in red, those are controls, 1, 2, 3. And those are the non-fenced areas. And that shows kind of the density of trees over time for each of those 3 plots. The next line down between the red and the blue is the cow exclosure. So that's going to be your 2-strand barbed wire fence area for the same time period for 3 different plots. And then finally, the last one is kind of your deer and cow exclosure over time for 3 plots. So these are 3 paired, 3 paired plots and replicated over, or I guess monitored over time from 2016, the year of establishment, to 2022. And again, you'll see these data again, but it gives you an idea, like there seems to be some sort of a trend here on Cottrells. And then you look at the Phelps Ranch, which is in southern Humboldt. Cottrells is out by Bridgeville. And then you go to southern Humboldt on a ranch that is really serpentine soils, probably only open because of the soils. So pretty rough ground. But this is a north-facing slope on those shallow serpentine soils. And it's the same data set. So in red is the control groups. In between the red and the blue is the cow exclosure only. And then you can see the deer and cow exclosure on the bottom. So it makes you think that there's something going on. But again, this is only the number of oaks in each 20 square foot plot. So it's really just showing quantity. And these are the same data shown side by side, kind of on a different scale, where your deer exclosures, the hog wire basically panels are the dark green, and you have Cottrell Ranch on the left, Phelps Ranch on the right, and then the tan is your no fence areas for your controls and your cow exclosure only areas. So it's pretty interesting to see that there's definitely like kind of it seems as though there's a stair step kind of where the no fence isn't great, and then some fence is a little better, and then a real fence is actually meaningful. And when you lump them all together, your N is still only 18, right? So it's not very powerful. So you end up with these huge error bars or standard deviations, but you can see that as you start to monitor these things, they start to separate from each other a little more as we look at tree densities. And then kind of to make the talk shorter, I just did the exact same thing, looking at tree heights because it was more of the same graphs. But as you can see, looking at tree height, they start to separate each other from each other over time. And I also did the establishment data, or actually Wallace in our office did I did all these graphs, and did the establishment data, and it was a little clunkier and not as clean, and I think that was just human error. Whereas trees increase in establishment year one, maybe on year one becomes your 3 on year one becomes a 1 on year 3. So I don't know. It was messy, but I attributed that to just human error. So just summarizing in the last couple slides here is I think our preliminary results show that there really is a benefit to protecting these things, right? No surprise. I think it's also clear that deer browsing alone reduces oak seedling establishment, and that 8 years is long enough to start to see that difference, but it sure as heck isn't enough to be able to pull those fences and think that they'll survive on their own. Like after 8 years, I think our tallest trees are not quite to knee height or close there around knee height. So we're talking a long ways away from true release. And then I think the last thing I'll mention is you saw some pictures of 2024 grasshopper damage. But the reason we didn't include any of those data was because it was really hard to tell which of those trees were going to survive or not. So I think even after 8 years of protection, I'm worried that one bad grasshopper year can jeopardize the entire set of seedlings. Like it'll be fascinating to see what we come back to next August, July, to see if any of those trees were able to survive from their their root storage, which I think that they will. I just think it's going to be kind of depressing. So it's definitely something that I'm looking forward to monitoring for a couple more years to hopefully have something more definitive to say, but it looks bleak for them. So kind of my final thoughts is that if you are going to take the time to go protect seedlings and the seedlings exist on the landscape and they just need some protection, pick the toughest, most robust ones. And if you are going to take the time to do them, this picture on the left is a great example of a hog wire fence that was put up by one of the landowner cooperators that we work with. He thinks he put it up 24, 25 years ago. That tree still, again, this is that serpentine soil, so it's tough ground, but that tree still hasn't quite grown out of its cage, and the cage is now rusted and fallen apart, where the one that we built behind it out of kind of galvanized hog wire has hopefully a little more lifespan. So just imagine it can take 20, 30 years for these things to grow to that 6.5-foot height. And then the idea of tree tubes, I think, seems to make a lot of sense, and I wish it was something that we included in this project to see if we could get those trees taller faster. It's just not something that we were just ignorant to that, and is something that I would like to try in the future. But know that those things absolutely will attract cows. So potentially build a nice big robust fence and then slap a tube over them before you walk away. So anyway, I just wanted to say thank you for your time this evening, and that's all I have to share.
Thanks, Jeff. So there was more of a comment, but porcupines seem to like young oaks too, but those porcupine populations seem to be down. But do you have any evidence of that or any studies about porcupines impacting young oaks?
I don't. My dad did it. He was a forester at Berkeley for his master's degree, and he actually studied porcupines and their effect on trees. So he'd probably be my first person to call. But in my life, let's see, I've been in California most of my life, probably 32 years, and I've only seen 2 porcupines, and they were both dead. So, it's not a species that I think is contributing to landscape-wide detriment to the oak population at this point.
Thanks.
If I could tag on just a little bit, I mean, Jeff's super provocative, and I think there's a lot of challenge around how we protect young seedlings. And the Vexar tubes aren't perfect either for many, many reasons. And, so I think this kind of sets the stage for, well, how do we manage the existing trees we have? Because it's a dog-eat-dog world out there for these oaks, and there's a lot of pressure from many different sources that make it complicated to be successful. And so where we do have really viable, strong, vigorous trees left, I think that, merits some thought around, if oaks are important, how do you retain those on the landscape?
Yeah, and I think especially on the seedling piece, as I do lit reviews and read more, one of the pieces that fascinates me is this concept that if cows are removed completely, that you get this densification of residual dry matter, or for those of you that aren't grass nerds, it just means old dead grass from last year, and that residual dry matter can become a house for voles, which are just a mouse species essentially, right? And it makes complete sense when you think about it, but the fact that you could have vole populations increase to the point that they're decimating baby oaks, and it's because they have such good ground cover, all of that I find very fascinating, because it's not, I mean, I could be completely blind to it, but I don't think that I saw any vole damage where we were doing our work. But maybe it's just because there's cows there, or maybe it's because I saw a dead tree and wrote it down as a dead tree and didn't take the time to fully examine it. Like I just sincerely don't know.
Yeah, totally. And I think we've largely moved away from those Vexar tubes because they're hard to manage over time, and they create a lot of interesting humid environments, which create a bunch of place for pathogens to, exist in those tubes too. And we tend not to take them off. And I think their success has been pretty limited overall. All I'm saying is it's a provocative world to think about what you do, and there's no simple answer. And I appreciate all the questions. Like, we're telling you kind of what we've tackled and what we're working on, and there's a career worth of work in this space, at least. And Doug McCurry, illustrated that really adamantly, and he did great work to launch us to this place.
Absolutely. Jeff, we do have time for just one question before I turn over to Pascal. Did you try planting more than one oak sapling in the same cage to create competition and also protection?
Yeah, Kevin, thank you for the question. This is the first time I've given this talk, so I'm gonna take that and make a note of it. But yeah, that was a piece of my methods I failed to include, was that we located the same size cages in, like, so these were very, very far from randomly located. We located them over areas of existing oak trees that had the same existing oak tree in the same shape, like in the same footprint of cage. Not the same shape. We had to change the shape to exclude trees and gain trees. But the same area with the same number of seedlings at time of caging, if that makes sense. So the establishment rating was not equal, but the number of individuals inside the cage was equal, if that makes sense. So densities were the same, but age was not the same, but no planting at all.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Pascal. Pascal, you should have co-host status and should be ready to share. And why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself as well? Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
And can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Presentation mode. Okay. All right, so my name is Pascal Berrill, Professor of Forestry, Humboldt State, which is now Poly Humboldt University. This is, I'm presenting on behalf of a team, the dream team here, Martin Ritchie, his tech, Ethan Hammett, myself, and Jonathan Long. And we're going to talk about black oaks post-fire. So, real quick, the relevant background here is that we studied a deciduous hardwood. It's very widely distributed per the map on the right-hand side. And the black oak is common to many different California forest types. And some of the challenges or issues is that it's shade intolerant. And you've heard about the conifer encroachment problem. But there's also not a commercial market for this wood. The benefits then, why are we interested in California black oak? The acorns are highly valued by native peoples, and they also provide an important food source for many wildlife species. On top of that, we have benefits of mature black oak, California black oak. And those large mature trees, like you see in the picture on the left, is the benefits are not only nesting habitat, but also denning habitat. So denning habitat, for example, for the Pacific fisher, they prefer these mature large oak trees with these broad crowns, as you see in the picture. Now let's talk about black oak and fire. Fire is, we'll call it a double-edged sword in terms of it has a high intensity fire will top kill most or all of the black oaks. Even the largest mature trees will be top killed. The root systems stay alive. That's why we call it top kill. However, if you have a low intensity wildfire, and hopefully in the past these were more frequent low intensity fires, that fire appeared to provide benefits. And so the larger trees would survive a low intensity fire, and the fire would take out the competition. And so this really helped us, our oaks, stay ahead of the competition by surviving a low intensity fire. And then some say that black oaks themselves can be beneficial in terms of acting as a sort of a fuel break, because their crowns, their canopies don't carry fire so well. And so this is this idea, not my idea, but there's this idea that if you instead of just clearing fire breaks, you may have some oak trees that would provide some shade in these fire breaks, that perhaps that shade would have some benefits, like trying to keep the brush down and to keep those fuel breaks open longer. So continuing with the fire story, the black oaks are easily killed by the high intensity fire, but look in the pictures here how it responds. It responds with basal sprout. And so pictured here in these two images, you'll see the central tree. We're calling this the snag now. It's not a tree anymore. It's the old oak tree that was top killed by the fire. So here's a snag, and here's the central snag. This was the original tree, girdled by the heat from the fire, and it's resprouted from the base, and it's sprouted all around with multiple stems. And so the root system stayed alive and it resprouted. Now these sprouts are numerous, and they will self-thin over time. And according to McDonald, who looked at this a long time ago, it's sort of a 30+ year process of self-thinning. And so now this could be the Stackhouse family property. This is part of the Fountain Fire, and right 30 years ago. So 30 years on, look at these oak sprout clumps. The snags have fallen. This is just winter time, so the leaves are off. They don't look so good in the winter, but how do these multi-stemmed oak sprout clumps that are 30 years on compare to the picture over on the left, which is our sort of desired oak, mature, established oak tree that's good for habitat. These multi-stemmed oaks are don't appear to be as valuable ecologically. And that's 30 years on. So, is it possible that we could reduce the number of stems in these clumps early on and see that the growth might be allocated to fewer stems, so a thinning within the clump, and let the tree or the root system allocate that growth to fewer stems that might grow faster, have accelerated growth? This was a question we're trying to answer. And can we maintain fewer stems over time? Will it work to thin and hopefully end up with larger trees like we see in the other pictures faster? So this is our study, and we have 3 different experimental treatments compared, and so those are in the pictures below. So looking at the pictures, picture 1 is thin the entire clump of multiple stems down to just 1. So this is the best, the dominant sprout, thin down to 1. Or the middle picture, thin down to leave the 3 dominant sprouts, and we space them around the clump, as well as choosing the better formed, larger, more vigorous sprouts. And then the third treatment is the untreated control, and that's on the right. And so that's we just left those multi-stemmed clumps alone. So that's our experiment. And we looked, we did this 5 times in each wildfire, and we looked at 13 different wildfires around Northern California. So, so you all see the treatments here: thin down to 1 stem, thin down to 3 stems, or just do nothing. That's what we're going to be talking about from now on. These are the fires that we worked in. So our experiment is, Northern California wide. It covers a good range of environments, and also these fires. These are all different wildfires that we thinned these young resprouting oaks in. Looking now at the 13 different fires, they burned in different years, and so this is a way that I'll try to explain our timeline of our study. We have the wildfire here at time 0, and then some time elapses. It could be 3 years before we did our thinning treatments. But in another fire, it may have been 4 years, 5 years, 7 years, 14 years, even up to 16 years between when the fire occurred and there was the growth of those unthinned clumps and when we thinned. So we have this thin late or thin early type of a comparison in our experiment. Now, the first observation happened when we implemented the treatments, and then our plan was to come back 3 years later and do an assessment. Well, a lot can happen in 3 years out there in the wild. We've had the mill fire reburned, so that burned through one of our experiments. In the King fire, some enterprising woodcutters came and took our snags from our clumps. And so when you come and you take that snag, that's nice dry cured black oak firewood standing there. And so we learned not to put our study so close to the road, because so they damaged that site. And then after we collected 3 years response data, the pigeon fire reburned. So anyway, we're lucky we did this at many sites, because we're losing sites. But anyways, you see the plan here. We have a wildfire, then years elapse, and then we implement our treatments, and then we came back 3 years later to assess. What did we find? There was growth acceleration from thinning. So sort of distilling our analysis down to assuming that there was a 5 centimeter, that's a 2-inch diameter dominant stem. The treatment thinning down to just 1, the best stem, resulted in a 70% increase in the dominant stem basal area increment. So that is how much wood essentially got put down, or grown or carbon sequestered, whatever. How fast that single stem grew. There was a 70% enhancement in wood accumulation on that 1 stem, because it was the only stem on the clump. If we thin down to 3 stems, we saw a 25% increase in basal area increment among those 3 stems. So yes, thinning down to leave 3 stems did result in an enhancement in diameter growth. which is good because we're trying to grow larger diameter oaks for to accelerate the development of this sort of habitat. Now, basal area is cross-sectional area, and so don't get too excited because what we have here is the circles on the inside. They represent the stem at the starting time, and then we go, let's just use our model to game things out 6 years. So you can see there's better growth after thinning down to one stem, but it's not very impressive when you look at just the diameter growth, is it? And so we're seeing an enhancement in growth, but it's not spectacular. It sounded more exciting when I gave it in percent terms than when you actually look at the cartoon diagram, but we are seeing an enhancement in growth. So 6.2 to 6.6 to 7.3 centimeters. So is everybody on board with thinning down to just one stem then? Does that seem like the best? Well, maybe not. And that is because we have a problem with resprouting. And so when we do these treatments and we thin down to one remaining stem, look at what happened here is that we did this thinning and lo and behold, we had yet another sprouting episode. And so here we have the thin dominant sprout that you see, and then around it is a little tutu of younger resprouts. And so that is a undesirable outcome because we just spent a lot of time and effort thinning a clump, and now we're back to having multiple stems again. That is counterproductive. So when we thinned down to 3, and they were well distributed around the clump, the 3 stems, we found that that had a suppressing effect on the resprouting. And so the graph from the published paper that we published shows that on this frequency distribution, most of the stems, when we thin down to leave 3 on a clump, this tall yellow bar means that 87% of those did not resprout. That's wonderful. 87% after the thinning did not resprout when we left 3 on the clump. Some of them did, of course, resprout a little bit, but this is much better than when and we didn't really see more than we didn't see too many sprouts on the ones that did resprout. Now, this is when you thin down to 1 sprout. What does this mean? This means that when you thin down to leave 1 dominant sprout, the plant responds by making many more sprouts. And so this was unfortunate, but we did find that about 32% of the thinned clumps didn't resprout, so that's good. But unfortunately, the remainder sprouted quite a lot. So this seems counterproductive to thin all the way down to 1 stem. I wish we'd tried leaving just 2 stems. Oh well, maybe next time. So here's a picture of the one that resprouted, and here is one that was thinned down to 1 stem. Here's a picture of one on the left. You see this one got thinned down to 1 stem and did not resprout. So there is variation, there's noise here in this data, but expect some quite a lot of resprouting. Okay, so what do we take from the study? Here are the main results that I've presented. Let's just go over them again, the main results. You can expect some improvement in stem growth. That stem growth rate will vary, and the improvement, the response will vary across sites, and it will vary by size. The oak stems that grew the best were the largest. So you've got a better response where we picked larger stems. And so always try to pick the best ones to keep. And then in the long run, you might be better off saving 2 or 3 stems, not just 1, if you're going to do this type of a thinning treatment. So those are the big takeaways. And now I want to see if I have sort of more data in the minutiae, but really I think we should just open this up to questions and discussion and see what else we can learn about this together.
Thanks, Pascal. Yeah, we do have a couple of questions. So you mentioned, fire behavior within black oak stands. So a participant asked then, can a black oak stand help then a crown fire drop to the ground?
I've only heard of that happening in aspen forests. I've heard of the aspen forests sort of serving as a natural fire break, but I am not aware if the black oak will do that. I sort of hinted at it, didn't I? And that wasn't me. That was Martin Ritchie's contribution to this presentation. And so I would have to turn over to other folks here. Yana, Jeff, have you heard or seen that in the literature, or does anyone else here have any sort of evidence of that?
I don't have any evidence. I think it's an intriguing question, but I don't know if I understand what the mechanism is, because largely a fire is driven by surface fuels and then it moves into the crown, and rarely do you have independent crown behavior. So a green foliage, is that going to prevent the fire from moving? I think probably less likely. And you'll see a little bit more about what I'm going to talk about in a minute related to fire. So I'm not saying that it won't ever happen, but it seems it's more of a surface fire issue from my perspective.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And it is nuanced, isn't it? And that I think that maybe the opportunity there lies with the fact that oaks tend to grow or are happiest and healthiest at wider spacings. And so we could manage it as more of sort of a oak woodland savanna setting with widely spaced oaks. And that might serve better as a fuel break than what we think of as a closed canopy oak stand.
Another participant asked, you mentioned the 25% increase in basal increment in the 3-stem treatment area. Was that per stem or in sum?
Oh, right. Great question. Yeah, so that was for the dominant stem, so the largest one.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason we focused on looking at the growth of the dominant stem in the clump, whether there was one stem there that we left, or whether we left 3 stems, or whether it's an unthinned clump, we went in and we monitor the largest stem, because you can see where I'm going with this, because that is the one that we eventually think is going to be the oak tree with the large stem, the large crown that we want. That's our end goal. And so we monitored the growth of that. And so great question. Yeah, so because there's 3 of them, I guess they're all working together to photosynthesize and feed the root system, but they're individually not having to respond so quickly to that drastic thinning like the single stem is. There's another issue. It's not just growth. There's also sort of a risk that comes with thinning down to just one stem, because when you thin down to one stem, and we saw this, the snag is going to fall at some point, the old snag that was top killed. And if you're really unlucky, it falls on your single oak stem that you've been tending and you've got such high hopes for, and then it gets knocked over by the falling snag. And so at least having 2 or more, you have some insurance there, so risk mitigation.
And do you think that any of this, I mean, you're focused on the black oak, but do you think any of this could be applied to the Oregon white oak as well?
I mean, yes, I think that we need to study this. It would be the next step. The next step would be to do another study in different wildfires, looking at multiple hardwoods that resprout, and so not just the oaks, but we have a drone. There's so many important oak species in California, and we have so much fire that I think that this study could be improved, maybe looking at the thin down to 2 stems treatment and repeated across multiple species. I think it'd be cool to get landowners involved and do sort of citizen science. Everybody could get out there and thin a few, because it really is fun. I mean, the first few are fun.
Yeah.
So yes, I think the concept should apply.
Mm-hmm.
But I dare anybody to disagree with me. I hope they would.
Do the reburned sites have more or less resprouts than the single burned sites?
Oh yeah. So we've done a little bit of work on that. There's been some work done by myself and by others that show that after a reburn, the oak will resprout again, and they'll resprout quite well. And so a reburn is I don't think it's a terrible thing for oaks in particular. And again, anybody here, please correct me if I'm wrong, but what we've been seeing is that is just yet again eliminating the competition for the oak, which is able to resprout from its root system. But I'm sure there's more to it than that. Yana and Jeff help jump in and build on that if you want to.
I'll say it'd be great to pair you with one of our colleagues, Mike Jones, who's been doing a bunch of post-fire work, and he's got a lot of thoughts about the overall physiology of these trees and, you know, how much damage to what kind of response do you get, and a lot of surprises, I think, in the multi-year following fire analysis process. So I don't know if Jeff, you got any ideas?
Mike Jones is doing great work down there, and he's fun to work with too.
Yeah.
All right, well, we have got time for one more question before I turn it back over to Yana. Did the size of the resprouts at the time of thinning seem to have any impact? More or less subsequent resprouting, greater impact to basal increment increase, etc.?
What a great question. Yeah. So every year that goes by, after the fire, these sprouts are getting bigger. And so look at this picture that we see here in the middle, for example. You know, that we've left this one a little bit late in terms of now to thin this clump is going to be more laborious. The stems are larger. And so every year that goes by, they grow quite quickly from their established root systems, and it's harder work. Not only is it harder work, but you're cutting these stems, they're bigger. And so that's more fuel now that you're putting on the ground because you're thinning. What do you do with these cut stems? You drag them away, you pile them, you scatter them. You know, there is a big advantage to doing it sooner, earlier. Now, we only did 3-year response. We'd like to do this again to get maybe like a 8 or a 10-year response, but we didn't find a whole lot of differences in those aspects according to time since, or you know, age of thinning. But I would say if anyone just wants the answer, like, hey, when do I do this? I would say look at trying to do it around age 3. You know, just get in there and get it done soon when you're cutting small stems and you're not creating so much of a fuel load on the ground. Just get it going. But if you're late and you still want to get this done, you can do this. We did it as late as 16, but you know, we weren't using hand loppers at that point. We were using chainsaws, and we were creating, you know, it was more work. But it's good work worth doing, I think. And nobody asked about the acorns, and because acorns are such a valuable food source, and so we have this sort of not a strong result, but I will go ahead and share it here, and that is that we found, counter to other studies that said production doesn't start till age 30. No, here we found acorns on the 86% of the clumps that were age 11 in this one wildfire were already producing acorns. So 11-year-old sprouts, 86% of the clumps had acorns. And then after 16 years in this other fire, only 46% acorns. You see how it's so variable? The 14-year sites, for some reason, had really low acorn production. So it's so variable across sites. It's really hard to say anything too much, but check this out. If you'll allow me this extra minute, look at 3 years later. So this is now the fire, 6 years after fire, 3 years after thinning. We're already seeing acorns on 14% of the clumps. And this is only 3 years after the thinning treatments. So 3 years after thinning, which was also 7 years after the wildfire, we're starting to see acorns coming in, and we're starting to see a lot of acorns on clumps as young as 8 years old. So what do we make of this data? It's very preliminary, and you see the variability. There's no acorns 12 years after this one fire, so it's not guaranteed. But I think the takeaway from this is, where am I? There's lots of variables: genetic variation, adaptive variation, climatic. You know, there's periodicity of the acorn crops. They don't come every year. You know, there's a lot of noise in this. But the third takeaway would be that acorn production happens much earlier than age 30 among the resprouting California black oak. And we might even go so far as to say you get some decent acorn production 6 to 14 years after fire. So good news to end on. And here's a picture on the right of a 3-stemmed oak that's already starting to look like it's got a big broad crown and it's starting to look like something, you know. So I think it appears to have some benefits to do this work, even though it is hard work.
That makes sense to me, Pascal. I mean, I think acorn production is often correlated with crown position and sun exposure, and then that those gap years could follow with the cyclical nature of acorn production, which is hard to predict or understand. So I guess the way I think about the world, that both those pieces make sense to me.
Awesome. Well, let's keep doing these studies and keep monitoring.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Pascal. There are many more questions. We'll try to get to them at the end, but right now I'd like to turn it back over to Yana. So Pascal, you just need to stop sharing your screen when you have a second. Thank you.
Well, terrific. And I look forward to interaction from our team here at C. I'm gonna pick back up in my talk here. And as sorry, too many things to do. We were talking about in the beginning, sort of this issue of the conifer encroachment issue, and you know, Pascal just gave us some post-fire experience. I want to also share that there's this issue of how long does it take for a Douglas fir to become co-dominant, so at basically around the same height as the oaks. And in our research across those 10 sites, we saw that process could happen on the wetter sites in as early as 20 years, and on the drier sites somewhere in the 70 to 80 year range, between both Oregon white oak and California black oak species. So the process happens rather quickly, certainly happens in my lifetime. And, you know, I want to share that I own a bunch of that on the property that I grew up in Humboldt County. So there's a lot of data behind this. I'm not going to share all of the studies that have happened across the Pacific Northwest, but we were particularly interested in both the Natural Resource Conservation Service and the Fish and Wildlife Services programs, and how their restoration approaches, which have been going on for, I don't know, 15 to 20 years or so to date, how they were affecting what we might call oak survival, really, and sort of what is the restoration effectiveness in this. And so I just have a couple highlights from this. It's a replicated study across, now I'm going to forget, but I think it's maybe another 15 sites or so. Jeff, pipe in if you remember exactly, maybe it's 13, that looked at a variety of different approaches to restoration. And you know, one of the questions we had was, do the oak crowns, so the green part of the tree, do you see release? And, you know, how fast do you see release? And so you've got black oak on the left and white oak on the right. And is that right? I think that's right. No, I think these are both white oak. Sorry about that, haven't given this talk for a little while. But we basically do see a process of release, and we do see a difference between treatment and control, with treated sites having larger crowns, and that white oak responded more than black oak, which is shown on the right-hand side. And I don't have a clear understanding of what that mechanism is, except for that maybe there's more limited resources on the white oak stands, which tend to be a little clayier soils and a little poorer overall. But it was nice to see that in a post-restoration approach that we could see oak crown release. So basically, once you pull off all that competition of all those conifers, are the oak trees able to respond? And will they be able to have enough resources to be able to invest in crown development? And our answer is yes, there. One of the other questions we had was, could we see radial increment growth? So when you take a core of a tree, can we see some level of growth? And so what I'm showing for you in this site is some tree cores from oaks. They're really hard to core, so let me temper expectations around coring. We were looking at the last 15 years or so, and I'll show you where the restoration time period occurred. But we're reading these cores. Each of these red lines represents a year, and in our project time period, we overlap with that 15-16 drought that was so prominent across California and really across the North Coast here. So this is from a control site, meaning that there was no restoration, and you can see basically during that drought period that the trees slowed down in their growth considerably. And I want to contrast that to a site where the conifer removal had occurred. And I'll just be straight up, like this is a dry site. It's out in Trinity County. And so what I'm showing for you is, look at this. So really tight rings, and all of a sudden you get a large amount of growth. And this overlaps with the drought that occurred in 15-16. So I think it's a really good indicator that even when these trees begin to decline because of all that pressure of the conifers dominating, the photosynthetic capacity, because they're shading out everything, that these oaks are able to respond in that situation. So folks in Oregon and Washington have also observed the same phenomena. They've been able to see that the oak crowns will reinitiate and do a bunch of what we call epicormic sprouting, where you get adventitious buds, and those put out new leaves throughout the crown and even throughout the branches that haven't had leaves on them. And so these trees really can come back to some degree. And so I think that's pretty exciting news overall. So one of the other curious questions we've had is, how do these oaks fare in the face of wildfire? And while not a controlled experiment, again, coming back to those slides I showed in the beginning, where the black oak and white oak are, this red area overlaps with the 2020 August fire. That was that 1 million acre fire, the largest fire we had on record. And it took place in an area that was really remote, not a lot of people, and so there wasn't a lot of resources put on it. That's in part why it got so large. The conditions switched somewhere along the way, and it had a big growth day. It grew about 20 miles. And what was helpful for us is that we had a research site located in Trinity County in that period of where the big growth occurred. And we were super curious, like, how did these sites, which had had a bunch of conifer removal using a variety of different approaches, where some sites were lopped and scattered, so the cut trees were then cut and left on the ground, and they were lopped and left to decompose, to other sites where they had used more mechanized approaches and had removed some trees and either used them for firewood or masticated them or burned them. And so there was less overall surface fuels left on site. How did they fare when this, beast of a fire burned through these locations? And so when we got there, this picture really told the story. So on the left-hand side, you can see an area where there had been removal of conifers. On the right-hand side is an area where there had been no interventions, and there was a lot of conifer encroachment. Both sides also had this manzanita encroachment, so you can see these dead stems of manzanita. And so when the fire burned through, it burned really hot on the encroached side, and it didn't burn that hot on the treated side. So we were curious. All right, here's what we see just by images. Let's, check our assumptions. And we laid a bunch of plots in on top of our area where we had pre-fire data. And Wallace Robinson, who was on this Zoom earlier, was really instrumental in helping conduct a lot of that data assessment. And so we got some really fascinating information. So what I want to share with you are live trees. And there are 2016, which is basically pre-fire, what the amount of live trees were. So you can see that overall live trees across these 3 different treatment types is about the same. And then 2021 is the tan, which shows after the fire went through. And so what you can see on each of these pairs is that live trees were taken down considerably. So when the fire went through on the control sites where no treatment had done, we lost a lot of trees. We went from, almost 80% live trees down to something under 50 kind of across the board. Now we had 3 different types of treatment also. And what was fascinating, so here's a site where there was a lot of both Douglas fir and manzanita. We saw pile burning and mastication. And I often have concern around mastication because mastication isn't removal of fuels. It's just taking them from the crown and they're being ground up and they're being left on site. And so there was both burning, which removed a bunch of the fuels, and then a little bit of mastication. And in that case, we basically saw a little bit of live tree loss. So that's what's shown here on the left. It's significant from the pre-burn to the post-burn, but overall we had pretty good tree survival. Here's another site on the very right-hand side where when they did those treatments, we had basically no loss in the oak trees following that treatment. But where in the middle, this, we call it fur lop and scatter, basically where the cut trees were left on site, we had significant mortality between the treated and the treated before and after fire. So when you leave a bunch of those surface fuels, it has a residual effect, a lingering effect. If you put fire in this case, in kind of the extreme condition, it led to a lot of mortality. Coming back to that question that Pascal and I were riffing off of. So how you treat the stand, I think, matters a lot. The good news is that if you can manage the surface fuels, this is kind of one of the most extreme potential litmus tests. I think we can do really well, and it shows the resilience and the importance of these oak trees and their ability to both be resilient in the face of drought as well as resilient in the face of wildfire if we can take some of that competition off the site. So now I want to just pivot to how do you think about tools and management of these encroaching conifers into these oak sites. And I'm going to take in a little bit of deep dive. I know there's a couple of foresters on the call. So, California is complicated, and I'm going to try and make it accessible to you, but it was not simple to be able to create tools for landowners to be able to manage this conifer encroachment issue. And so again, we're talking about this distribution, which affects a pretty good section of the forested parts of California. And you can see the overlap with Douglas fir. So Douglas fir is intermixed in much of the same locations of where the oaks are, just from a kind of pure growth scale. They hang out in similar zones. We see very much a soil relationship between where the oaks are and where the conifers are. And what's happened because of the loss of frequent fire, which was predominantly low severity fire, we basically facilitated the conifers getting into these sites. And in that process, they convert the site from an oak site to a conifer site. So again, what do you do in a situation like this? What do you manage for? The conversion process is well underway at this point. Should you choose the oaks? Should you choose the conifers? What are your goals? And I'm here not to share what your goals should be, but just to say that we've managed to create some changes in the regulatory framework in California to enable you to either make that choice, whether you're going to let it move into a more conifer condition or a more oaky condition. So I need to share with you how that occurred. And so, pardon the regulatory framing around this, but in California, we have Group A and Group B species. And if you take a look, Group A species are all the conifers: redwood, Douglas fir, grand fir, hemlock, cedar, pine, fir, Jeffrey pine, ponderosa pine, sugar pine. And then we have Group B species, which are predominantly hardwoods, tan oak, alder, white oak. California black oak, white alder, madrone. And so the way that the rules are framed is to prevent high grading. So that you can't come in and take the best, which would be group A species, and leave behind group B species, which are considered of lower commercial value. And so there's a stopgap in the way that the rules are structured to prevent that high grading from occurring. But it gets complicated when in reality, the group B species are what the site is designed to support, and group A species have moved in. So what do you do? And so that was a real dilemma. The way the rules, the California Forest Practice rules, and the Zeeberg-Negley Forest Practice Act are set up is really to focus around the regeneration setup and how do we ensure a future stand of crop trees, generally conifers. So group A species shall not be reduced relative to group B species. So the same proportion. So if you have 50% of group A to 25% of group B, after harvest, you should still have that same proportional relationship to each other. And if you take group A off of group B, then that can constitute a conversion. So I appreciate the framing that the rules are set up for, but when you think about it from a restoration perspective, it's a little harder to bring forward this encroachment issue to fit through this lens. So what has occurred has been a sequence of regulatory changes that have occurred both through the legislature and through the Board of Forestry to make it possible to manage for, in this case, the group B of black oak and white oak species relative to group A that have moved in to those sites. And so here's an example of a commercial timber harvest that occurred for the goals of restoration. And now we can see an oak stand that has been released from that restoration, that encroachment burden. So, you know, in that process, we've enabled a place where people from all different vantage points can come together and you know, find the places of value, their goals, their shared interests, or not shared interests, but their shared love for oaks. So how did that happen? That was done through a two-pronged approach where you may have heard some of this language. There are exemptions in the forest practice rules, which are not exempt from the timber harvest planning process, but it's a slightly more streamlined. And so our data was used to basically establish what is an oak woodland. And in this case, it was 35 square feet of basal area. So that is the amount of tree area that's on an acre that is in trees. And so it's a pretty widely spaced, not quite a woodland, I mean, not quite a savanna, but a woodland. And so if you have enough oak basal area, so it's really an oak site, you have sort of two options. And so what I want to share with you is kind of this decision tree framework. So assuming that you have enough basal area, and this is for those folks that either have to get a CEQA basis for maybe some funding, or they're interested in being able to merchandise some of those conifers because they're now of a size class where you could actually sell them. That might help pay some of the restoration costs. So typically a merchantable conifer is something that's greater than 12 inches at diameter at breast height, which is 4.5 feet. So it's a tree you can put your arms around still. So if you have trees of that size, and you have oaks that are living, that are 35 square feet occupying that site, then there's sort of two options. If your conifers are not merchantable, you know, then there are a variety of cost share and assistance programs that are available, especially through the federal funding partners like the Natural Resources Conservation Service or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service through their partners program. There are also some options through CAL FIRE and the CFIP program. So, you know, that would be the channel you would go before the commercial scale. And you might end up blending, you know, as you look at the landscape, you know, some areas are in commercial capacity, some areas aren't. And so you might use some assistance programs on the edges and, you know, kind of feather the treatments together. Can't overlap them, but you can, keep them separate and distinct. And then I just really want to bring forward that once the restoration has occurred, using controlled and prescribed fire can be really effective at being able to maintain conditions and maintain the seedling establishment from conifers that often, will occur again because we may be in close adjacency to where those the soils are more hospitable and it's a true Doug fir site. So, there are many passes and many approaches to this. So bringing forward, assuming that you have a site where you've got commercial capacity for removal of the Doug fir, there are two routes. One is called the special prescription, which is related to typically a timber harvest plan or a non-industrial timber management plan. And there are no size constraints on how big the trees can be by diameter. There's no limit on project size. And it's basically a typical harvest plan. And what the difference is that you meet the post-project stocking. So after you've done your treatment, your stocking is met through the oaks. And my assumption, and this is beginning to be used, is that it's kind of married in with a larger overall timber harvest planning process on a particular property. It's a fair bit of planning costs to do the special prescription on its own. And then we were also able to create an exemption, which is more a limited kind of checklist-oriented prescription. And the exemption was limited in diameter for the conifers that can be removed at 8 inches at stump height. So instead of at diameter, it was at 8 inches at stump height, and it was a pretty small tree overall. And it was limited to the number of acres per ownership and had a bunch of restrictions within that. So that's how we've been operating for, I think, about the last 7 years. And these permits have begun to become popular, and we're seeing increasing use on them. And it's exciting. I think we've got about 3,000 acres in California that have now had this more commercial-oriented harvest planning work and have led to basically the restoration of these oak stands. This year, my colleague you've met, Jeff Stackhouse, and I did a bunch of interviews of both landowners and foresters and asked how these were doing overall. And using that information, we worked with Cal Forest to share kind of what was going on. And they had a bill moving forward. And so they took our data and harmonized the exemptions that are out there. And so what is coming is basically a bunch of revamp to the exemption, which I think is going to make it even more usable and in line with those that want to do this kind of restoration work. So conifers need to be within 300 feet of a living oak tree. It needs to be an oak stand. The items in green are where we've been, and we anticipate by the end of this next year, this will be officially codified. It went forward as emergency regulation, so you should be able to start to use this pretty soon. So the limit has been less than 26 inches at an 8-inch stump height. So that's, functionally maybe a 22-inch tree. And it's going to be harmonized across all the other exemptions that exist to a 30-inch tree at diameter at breast height. So we're going to add 8 or so inches on the conifer that can be removed using the exemption. And of course, a forester, a registered professional forester, has to prepare these documents. It can be allowed within an existing non-industrial timber management plan. This is a little bit of regulatory speak, but just for those foresters out there, just to know that this is a really useful tool. It's still limited to 300 acres per 5 years in a planning watershed, but it's per ownership. So it can be bundled with other neighbors. You still can't put it in a watercourse like protection zones. So there's some issue because you do see the conifers landing in those streamside areas. It requires a lot of the typical stuff. But what has also been removed is that there was an exclusion in the southern subdistrict of the Coast District, and that is being struck from this. So this should be applicable to all the areas in California that have this encroachment issue on it. And so that's, I think, a real win for the oaks, and really a part of this kind of dueling identity issue where essentially conifers have been king in California's regulatory framework. And this, decade of work in partnership with a lot of great folks, especially California Assembly Member Wood, who just is terming out this year, really gave legal standing for deciduous oaks, these two oak species in particular, and that I think is changing our framework and how we think about value importance, especially in the kind of the resiliency frame, and how we face these issues of drought and of wildfire, and it's just really giving some standing for these oak species. All of our work, Pascal's work, other colleagues in different universities have really brought statewide attention to this issue, which is super exciting. And I think through our work we've been able to confirm, like in other locations, restoration works, but we really need to pay attention to the next entry and a plan for future use of prescribed fire. So if you cut a bunch of trees and leave them on the ground, you just move trees from standing to surface fuels, and that will have an impact on both your ability to use prescribed fire as well as what will happen if a wildfire comes through to the residual stand. So how do oaks fare well in the face of wildfire? When surface fuels are low, when we've removed that, cut material, oaks can do really well. And I'll just, wrap up by saying we've given a legal pathway for restoration and the ability to merchandise some of these cut conifers. They're not perfect. They are, those conifers are a little lower in value. They've taken some damage while kind of battling out with those oak trees, but they certainly do have some commercial value, and we might as well utilize that to help sort of subsidize some of this work. So for me, these oaks are really special places with my family and my culture. And, if they are for you too, I would just say, this has been a real win for the oaks and a real opportunity, I think, for people to have a more complete toolbox to be able to manage these species. So with that, I just thank you for your attention and the opportunity to work with such great colleagues on this webinar, and turn it back to you, Kim.
Great. Thanks, Yana. That was great. A question related to you were mentioning the growth response rate of oaks early on when conifers are removed. Do you suspect, or have you seen evidence that the same type of response will occur if you're removing like bay trees within oak woodland areas?
I think it depends if they're in the dominant canopy position. It's really it's a competition for light, and depending on your site, maybe a competition for water. If you've got bay trees, it's probably a wetter site, and so water may be less limiting overall. We're really waiting for this next project where we're looking at what we've been calling the silent straws, the impact of this silent encroachment process, which is absorbing a lot of water through photosynthesis and removing that from the system, and trying to understand, what is the ecosystem consequence of densification on these stands. And so that's kind of our next phase, is trying to get a handle on that to the best of our ability. Very complicated question. I don't think we'll get all the answers, but we'll start to open the box of discovery.
Mm-hmm. Great. All right, well, I'm going to scroll back to some of the previous questions. I'll let the participants know that we're not going to get to all of them, but those that we don't get to, we're keeping a track of that. We'll get those questions to our speakers, and we'll get those out to you in a week or so. So Yana, in your first presentation, when you were talking about the studies that you were doing, the question is, did you try to estimate site quality using a conifer site index or an alternate method and correlate with encroachment quantity and quality?
No, and it's a great question. I mean, it's an observational study and just trying to find sites that have those three phases of encroachment. And that's why I was saying there's a bias towards the white oak stands, because most of the black oak stands are already pretty encroached at this point. And I think one of the really fundamental challenges is that we don't even know what the base point is to work from. And if you think about that, our data shows this real change in relationship from 1850, but when do we have the first recorded and consistent data to be able to think about these distributions of these species. For most of us, that's through aerial photographs, and those don't occur until the 40s as the first baseline. That's almost 100 years into this process of change. And so, a lot has happened in that time period. So, one of the questions we tried to answer, I think 3 different times, is how much loss have we seen? And the answer is a lot, but it's super hard to document in any consistent way because we don't have a base map. At some level, I don't know that I really care. I think what I'm trying to do is bring tools to people who, want to manage these oaks, and, no pressure if you don't. But, if you do, then, at least to have, a few tricks up your sleeve to be able to help achieve your overall, kind of ecosystem goals in general.
And a couple questions for you, Pascal. Is it feasible to do this kind of resprout management on a large scale?
Yeah, good question. Large scale, this is laborious work, but what I would say is you don't have to thin every single clump. Imagine in a wildfire area, you just went through and thinned a subset of these clumps. You could thin some down to 2 stems, some down to 3 stems, leave a bunch of them unthinned, and then you'll still be having a positive benefit across the landscape by accelerating the development of a broad, large, round crown and these habitat characteristics of a single-stemmed oak. You don't have to do it to every single clump. So that would be my answer to that. And
Is there some sort of, how would you identify the best clump to treat?
oh, that's a fun one to think about. Yeah. So yeah, where do you want these large crowned habitat or culturally important trees to be located? Do you want them on the ridges? Do you want them down mid slope? Do you want them all across the topography? Jeff talked about where you want oaks and where you don't want them, and I think that's going to come down to the individual landowner, isn't it? But what a cool question! What a fun one to think about. Where do you want to focus, or where do you want to spend your limited restoration dollars or effort? I think that's a good one to ponder. I don't have the answer there. Cool question.
When you only leave one stem, does that resprouting problem decrease with time since wildfire?
I think time will tell on that. But I think again, rather than focusing on these little things like 1 or 2 stems or 3, just we need to get this work done, I think, and so maybe doing a variety of things out there just to hedge your bets always on the landscape. Just go easy. So maybe leave 2 or 3 stems instead of 1, and don't thin every clump. And in terms of pruning lateral branches, what a great idea, but don't prune too many lateral branches, because then you've removed a lot of the photosynthetic area. And so if you take a tree's crown away, what's it going to do? Of course, it's going to respond by resprouting. So just everything, ease into things and try things on a limited scale. You can always come back next year and do more, but doing something is better, I believe, than doing nothing.
Well, and I think I would tag into that, Pascal, as someone that's been doing this selective propagation of black oaks my entire life, blindly, not as a scientist, right? I'm the grass guy, not the tree person. But I also, have a piece of paper that at least claims I'm a wildlife biologist. So I guess when I think about it, it's like I like to sit back and look at it as the landscape scale. And when you look at a landscape, and especially the size of the wildfires that we have, even if you prune every single tree on the area that you manage, I don't care if you're a large landowner or a small landowner, if you're willing to put that much time and effort into it, and then you look at the neighbors around you at the landscape scale, no effort is the standard. So any effort that's putting into it, I think, is something different and unique on the landscape. And I think collectively the scientific community has agreed that, you know, diversity is beneficial and good. And when you sit there and you're like, oh, my entire 40 acres or my entire 4,000 acres, I don't care what it is, in this wildfire footprint, I've pruned too high or pruned too aggressively or done X, Y, or Z. And then you look at your neighbors who have done nothing. I think nothing is the norm. So any effort you're willing to do is probably going to create biodiversity on the landscape. I think that's my take home from someone who grew up in one of these first large catastrophic wildfires is when I look at the neighbor, you know, when I look over the fence at the neighbor's place, there's a lot of the images that Pascal shared. And when I look on our side of the fence, I'm like, oh man, I think we were too aggressive on some of this pruning, but we're surrounded by 500,000 acres of non-pruning. So I don't know. You know, I don't want to take too much time, but I think it's a little bit of make it look like what you want it to look like, and it will, if it requires sweat equity and money, it's probably gonna be the anomaly on the landscape.
Do it in a place you care about. So you can see that, you know, see the product of your results.
All right. Well, we're going to end here. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and thank you very much to all of our speakers.